Thank you, Liz. Yeah, and I apologize to the formality of this with the microphone and everything else, but I think we're doing this because the session is being videotaped, and I think ultimately will be up online for use by you and other educators in the months and years ahead. I am a little bit of a fish out of water. I was trained as a Chinese art historian, especially focusing on early China. As a mid-career professional, I was working at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art in the mid-1990s through the early 2000s. And at that point, it was very important to that museum to develop a Korean program. As the head of the department, I was asked to spearhead that, and so as a mid-career professional, I had the opportunity to learn a completely new field. I've kept my oars in the Korean waters in the decades since then. I've learned a great deal from my Korean colleagues, both in Korea and here in the US, and so a lot of what you'll be hearing about this morning and tomorrow when we're in storage looking at paintings together is really more the result of teachings that I have luckily been able to pick up along the way from experts in the fields that I'll be representing for you today. I am not an expert in Korean art. I'm not an expert in Goryeo Buddhist painting, but they are subjects that are of great interest to me, and I am excited to share these subjects with you today and tomorrow. You might wonder why we're diving into such a narrow field so deeply, so early in this workshop. There are a number of reasons for that. Goryeo, which is an historical period that I'll be talking about on a timeline in just a second, is in fact the basis for the modern name for the country, Korea. So Korea, the country, takes its name from this historical period, the Goryeo dynasty. We'll be looking at Goryeo Buddhist paintings, which are, in a sense, the earliest surviving chapters of Korean pictorial depiction. So it makes it a very important topic for anyone interested in the representational arts. So we're looking at the origins of what we know of Korean painting by the examples that we'll be looking at this morning. And last but not least, this is an area of particular strength for this museum. Both the Korean paintings that we'll be looking at this morning, and then also the ceramics that you'll be looking at in the Korean galleries reflect the same time period. And so it will be a nice way for you to compare the decorative arts and the representational arts from this very important period. Most of the surviving Goryeo Buddhist paintings that we'll be looking at were produced in the last 150 years of the Goryeo kingdom and date from the mid-13th to the late 14th centuries. Their outstanding quality and aesthetic beauty convey the remarkable achievements of Goryeo Buddhist artists of this period. They also provide our only glimpse into the pictorial arts of the Goryeo period more generally, since no examples of other kinds of paintings exist from this period. And we're looking now at a detail of a painting that we'll be looking at a little bit later in the lecture, and then also tomorrow in storage. This is one of the great examples of Goryeo Buddhist paintings in the Freer and Sackler collections. The time period that we're focusing on this morning, the 13th and 14th century essentially, correspond to a moment in the European painting tradition where there was also a new phase in religious arts. And here I'm comparing a detail from another Freer painting, a beautiful Amitabha and the 8 Great Bodhisattvas on the left that was created during the 14th century, late 13th, to a detail from a 14th century Florentine altar painting that depicts Saints Bernard and Catherine that is now in the National Gallery. So these two works were created essentially at the same time in Europe and in East Asia. Viewed in its iconographic context, Goryeo Buddhist paintings have received attention more broadly in the East Asian field for two reasons. They demonstrate stylistic distinctiveness, and they also show one of the highest artistic achievements among all pictorial genres. So there you can see the Goryeo period highlighted in kind of salmon color, along with the time periods in China and Japan that are essentially the same date. And we'll be comparing Goryeo examples, Korean examples, with Chinese and Japanese examples to give you a sense of the relationships in religious painting traditions at this time period throughout the greater East Asian area. Another reason this subject is so interesting is it's a relatively new topic in East Asian art. The first significant public appreciation of these amazing paintings occurred only in the fall of 1978, when the Yamato Bunkakan in Nara held an exhibition on the subject. This was the first exhibition at any point in the 20th century, so it's a relatively new field of study. This show at the Yamato Bunkakan was historiographically important since Goryeo Buddhist paintings were finally being branded as Korean products and given the attention that they deserved. And here you're looking at the cover of the catalog. In Korea, the subject was first shared with the public at a large-scale exhibition in 1993, so even more recent, when a special exhibition called Goryeo Eternal Beauty was held at the Hoam Art Gallery in Seoul. That's the Samsung Museum. In terms of the bibliography and important monographic studies, the 1997 publication Buddhist Paintings of the Goryeo Period featured 133 works. That was all the paintings, the only examples that were known at the time of the publication, only 133 examples. It included high-definition color photographs of the paintings showing the finest details to stimulate new research. Now, more than 165 Buddhist paintings from the Goryeo period are known. 16 are located in the United States. 8 have been found in Europe. 26 are in Korea, and 115 are in Japan. With only 2 exceptions, these works measure between 60 and 150 centimeters and are all painted on a single piece of silk.
What kind of paint is used?
I'll be talking about that. Mineral pigments, super saturated mineral pigments, so that's why you get these really strong colors. Let's talk about the iconography. About 60 Goryeo paintings, that's out of this total of 165, so more than a third, relate to the Buddha Amitabha. Paintings related to Amitabha depict him preaching or on his way to greet those who will be reborn in his paradise after death, and those are the two kind of paradigms you're looking at here, a preaching Buddha Amitabha on the left, and a descending Amitabha Buddha on the right, greeting reborn souls that will be going to his paradise. Paintings related to Amitabha can be sorted into 3 groups based upon the number of deities in the scenes. The groups are Amitabha alone, like you see here on the left. Amitabha accompanied by 2 attending bodhisattvas, Avalokiteshvara and Mahastamaprapta, the 2 in the middle there, the Amitabha triad. And then on the right, the pair showing Amitabha accompanied by the so-called 8 great bodhisattvas. So these are the 3 classic compositions depicting this deity. In addition to these, there are a few sutra illustrations relating to Amitabha, but essentially it's those 3 types that we just looked at. Meanwhile, 46 of that total of 160 depict the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. The particular type shown here is known in Korea as the water moon Avalokiteshvara, or in Japan it's called the willow branch Avalokiteshvara, but you see 4 examples of the type here, all Korean, all Goryeo. There are also about 26 images of the Bodhisattva Kshitigarbha, the bodhisattva who redeems those suffering in hells and take them to paradise. A small number of paintings deal with rarer subjects, like we're looking at here. Others show arhats, Buddhist guardians, and so on. There are also a handful of Goryeo Buddhist paintings that depict two deities side by side. The paintings of two bodhisattvas, Avalokiteshvara and Kshitigarbha, and the two examples on the left here, are associated with salvation in the present world and after death. The example on the right, showing Amitabha with Kshitigarbha, is the only example in the world that's at the Metropolitan Museum. It's a rare iconography and one that needs further study. In addition, it should be evident from what I have just said that these works reflect a very narrow range of subjects. And that is a distinguishing factor that makes the Goryeo examples of religious painting very different from China and Japan. This is because the iconography is based on Mahayana teachings and does not include esoteric deities, so the subject matter is highly restricted. Among the 165 paintings, as you can see here, 60 depict Amitabha, 46 Avalokiteshvara, and 25 Kshitigarbha. In other words, paintings dealing with just these three subjects total over 130 works. That's, well over half. It can be said that these three subjects constitute most of the Buddhist paintings of the period in Korea. This iconographic focus needs to be remembered when considering issues such as the purpose of these paintings and the philosophical background that surrounds Goryeo Buddhist paintings more generally. The question of painting techniques came up. Let's look at that. The paintings can be studied physically in a number of ways to understand first their material properties and second of all the painting techniques. Here we're looking at images, infrared, soft X-ray, that allow you to penetrate the surface basically and see beneath the pigments to the structure of the painting and the pigments themselves. Also, microscopic views get right into the surface, and here the crisscross you're looking at is the actual weave of the silk support and the pigments riding on top, or in some cases actually applied to the back of the support of the paintings. And as you can see in the lower right-hand corner, examples of looking at both the front and the back of these paintings, because a distinguishing characteristic of the works of this period is that the artists are applying pigment to both the front and the back. This allows for kind of optical effects on the surface. The eye blends pigment that is coming through the back of the painting with the pigment that you see on the surface. This is kind of a trick to, in some cases, increase the volumetric nature of the deities that are being depicted. This Buddhist painting was created during the early 14th century. Although we're looking at just a photograph, we can still see very vivid colors of this 700-year-old painting. Let's take a closer look. So this is the left forearm of one of the bodhisattvas shown with the Buddha Amitabha down here in the lower left-hand corner. It is important to note that the main tones, red, azure blue, and green, are intense and strong. Even more interesting, none of the pigments seen in that painting or these were ever mixed to create a chromatic range. The masters chose this approach to keep the colors vivid, since mixing minerals often resulted in a loss of brightness to the pigment and the surface. These two paintings are great examples demonstrating the use of pure colors instead of mixing pigments. Here, to show transparency, elements of white are painted on top of the background color. So they are simulating a kind of transparent scarf or veil that is falling on top of the garments of the figure. We'll be looking at more examples of this in a moment. This addition of white pigment and a crisscross pattern simulates a kind of gauze that adds depth to the surface of the painting. In this example, the artist wanted to avoid dull appearances that might be caused by mixing white with other colors, but there is some white down here in the lower left-hand corner. A closer look reveals that the patterns were first drawn in ink. Next, the primary pigments were applied to that surface. And last, white was added around those primary patterns so that it didn't mix with the mineral colors. If the process had been different and if the pigments had been applied on top of the white, they would have lost their intensity. You might be able to catch some areas that are not entirely covered by paint, but remember that we're looking here at a tiny, tiny detail photographed through a microscope, essentially, that shows a small area of only 2 or 3 millimeters square. So this is not something that you would see with your naked eye. Why did painters use such a limited number of colors and restrict themselves to unmixed pigments? In my opinion, the answer is that they wanted to emphasize the brilliance of the gold lines of the patterns as much as possible, since gold was used for most contour lines as well as for the patterns of the textiles on the surface. Let's examine a few photos to get an idea of how effectively the gold is used in Goryeo Buddhist paintings. Here we're looking at two details from two different paintings of a Buddha's robe that is painted in red or green, and then the patterns of the folds of the robe are drawn in gold pigment, as well as the pattern of the garment itself. They are simple, but the paintings lack nothing in visual harmony. There seems to be no need to add any more colors, just the simple fields with gold patterns applied on top. Of course, both the red and the green are applied as pure, unmixed colors. Gold is also important in other aspects of these paintings. You can see that it's used for painting patterns and contour lines, but also drawing dragons and phoenixes as decorative patterns within the compositions. There's another reason why unmixed colors were preferred. As you can see in these examples, most Goryeo Buddhist paintings reveal a tendency to fill the surface with gold painted patterns almost completely, leaving little space unpainted. Here's another great example, and we're looking here at the detail of Avalokiteshvara seated on a rock, her arm covered with this gauzy white fabric. You can see the arm through the gauzy fabric. And it's not just a plain gauze, but a pattern has been painted on the gauze in gold. So it's a very complex optical effect. This is an image of the water moon Avalokiteshvara that was painted in 1323. It's now in the Sen Okuhakokan Museum in Japan. The photo presents an overall view of the painting with high quality and resolution. However, it does not reveal all the golden details, such as the pattern on the kundika, which you can see to the Bodhisattva's proper right, a sacred water bottle In reality, the entire surface of the kundika is covered in gold-painted patterns, and it's shown sitting in a glass bowl, so you're looking through the bowl itself to the base of the kundika. Now let's look at the patterns used for Goryeo Buddhist painting, fabric patterns. They range from chrysanthemum blossoms to phoenixes and arabesques. The lotus roundel is the most frequently observed patterns in these works. They appear not only on the Buddha's robes, but also on the garments worn by bodhisattvas in the same works. Unlike other patterns, the lotus roundel is used only for Goryeo Buddhist paintings, which enables us to distinguish them from related works produced in China and Japan. So if you see this kind of pattern on the garment of the Buddha or bodhisattvas, you know that you're looking at a Goryeo, a Korean work. To sum this part of the talk up, the basic colors used in Goryeo Buddhist paintings are red, azure blue, and green. Gold was an important pigment that was used for textile patterns and contour lines to create a vivid contrast with the pure mineral pigments used on the background of the garments. Obviously, these artists knew how to make the most of the gold paint, an undisputable medium for breathing life into their paintings. Possessing accurate knowledge of the technical details is crucial for correct characterizations of Goryeo Buddhist paintings. Not only does it help with distinguishing them from those made in the Chosun period, the subsequent period in Korea, but it also helps distinguish them from works that were produced at the same time in China and Japan, a topic that I will come back to in a minute. Let's turn to iconography and the iconographic similarity among these works. This, of course, relates to their intended function. As you've already learned, there are only 165 Goryeo Buddhist paintings that we're talking about worldwide. If not thoroughly scrutinized, some of them may nearly be indistinguishable from one another. The compositions are so similar. This strong degree of homogeneity, both in terms of the iconography and the technical details, is a salient feature of these works. For example, paintings of the Buddha Amitabha, Amitabha triads, Water Moon Avalokiteshvaras, the Bodhisattva Kshtagarbha, or Maitreya Sutra, all strongly relate to one another as well because of the pigments and the gold patterns of the robes. Oops. The reason for this may be gleaned from a few passages found in historical texts, such as the Goryeo-sa, the history of the Goryeo dynasty. So these are quotes from historical records. They made 40 paintings of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara in correspondence with the king's age. So these are obviously being produced for the royal court under presumably royal patronage. They then prayed in front of them on the evening of Shakyamuni's birthday with lanterns brightly lit. The king himself secretly followed those prayers so as to witness the scene. Likewise, a second passage, they painted 12 images of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara and held a Buddhist ceremony inside the royal court. So clearly multiplicity was important, and they must have been using very similar compositions, maybe even reproducible models, to make sure that there was a kind of consistency to the works that were produced. Such passages make it very clear that Buddhist paintings of the same iconography were often produced in large quantities at the same time. Additional records help understand the scale of the images. They're relatively small, remember. The king made a special favor of bestowing upon them one of the images of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara owned by the royal household. So they were used as gifts, possessed and also displayed within the court, but then offered as gifts to courtiers. In terms of where they might be displayed within the court, a small room was set up as a prayer hall where one can find spiritual peace. It lacked nothing in terms of objects and the supplies needed for Buddhist rituals. Emphasis here on the small size of that room or chapel within the royal court. Most of the Buddhist paintings we are discussing are of modest size. They were not intended for worship services in temples. Instead, they were meant to be hung in small prayer halls within the royal palace for viewing by a limited audience, such as royal household members or other aristocrats. Although not unrelated to the conservative nature of the Korean art in general, this consistency can be traced to circumstantial factors, such as the small class of patrons, the intended function of the paintings, and the place where they were used. So these aren't like massive wall paintings. As I mentioned earlier, among the 165 surviving paintings, 60 are associated with Amitabha, 46 with Avalokiteshvara, and 26 with Kshtagarbha. In other words, paintings dealing with those three subjects total almost over 130. Hence, the technical and iconographic similarities seen among these surviving examples are likely to have come from the fact that they were commissioned and used by a homogeneous group of people for similar purposes. In other words, a similar belief system and a stylistic preference shared by members of the royal court engendered relatively large numbers of paintings that look essentially similar. Let's compare this artistic tradition in Korea with the larger East Asian theater. Chinese influences on Korean art, although varying in degree and form according to the time and the genre, cannot be denied. China was a great influence on Korea. Therefore, the level of originality of a given Korean work is often determined by analyzing the extent to which it differs from a Chinese model. Goryeo and China were not only geographically adjacent, but they, and I'm sure you all can find China and Korea on this map. Here's China, of course, Beijing located up about here, the Korean Peninsula, and Japan. During this period, there was a lot of communication and trade going on between China, Korea, and Japan overland as well as by sea. China and Korea are supposed to have had considerable influence on each other throughout this period, given their shared belief in Buddhism. Unfortunately, however, there is such a dearth of written records about Buddhist paintings traveling between the two countries that it's really hard to speculate on the historical circumstances of such an exchange other than looking for stylistic influence in the works themselves. But there are a couple of historical references we can point to. The most frequently cited record regarding the exchange of Buddhist art between Goryeo and China is documentation about a painting of 500 arhats. And this is relatively early in the Goryeo period. In 913, Yun Chol went to the Liang court as an emissary representing Korea. He returned and presented the painting of 500 arhats. The king, the Korean king, had it enshrined in Sungsansa in Haeju. Another frequently cited record tells us that there was a Korean envoy who brought a number of painters to China. So these are Korean painters who were traveling to China and had them copy murals at Xiangguo Si in 1076. The painters then painted murals when they got back to Korea on the walls of a Korean temple in the capital of the Goryeo kingdom. I guess the artists of Goryeo, Korea, selectively accepted some of the styles and subjects and techniques of the Chinese Buddhist paintings, but did not accept everything that they saw. For instance, Goryeo Buddhist believers as well as artists generally did not adopt the iconographies that we're looking at here, chiefly those from esoteric Buddhism, such as Maha Mayuri and the Chintamani Chakra, and other iconographies that just don't show up in Korean examples, but do appear in Chinese and Japanese paintings. Meanwhile, in terms of compositions, Goryeo Buddhist paintings show a strong tendency to emphasize only the main subject, that is, the deity. For instance, and here we're looking at a Chinese, a Japanese, and a Korean treatment of the same subject. The Goryeo painting of the Descent of Amitabha Buddha does not depict the clouds that are shown in the Chinese and Japanese examples. This subject is meant to be the deity floating down from the heavens to accept you, the dying believer, to be reborn in his paradise. Also, Goryeo paintings of Amitabha preaching the law often represent only the Buddha Amitabha, or an Amitabha triad without an audience. These tendencies stand in stark contrast with those of Buddhist paintings in China, which strove to connect the compositional elements in a context and to convey the narrative through the composition. For example, the Descent of Amitabha triad in the Moa Museum, that's the Korean example on the right, depicts only the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas, just like most other Goryeo Buddhist paintings of the same subject, even omitting the clouds. Thus, the deities appear to be floating, standing on lotus blossoms in midair. In contrast to the Goryeo example, Chinese and Japanese versions of the Descent of Amitabha portray the clouds as if they were floating somewhere between the surface and the distance of the painting, so that the triad really does seem to be approaching us, making the descent of Amitabha Buddha seem more real. This approach can be seen in the Descent of Amitabha in the collection of the Leum Samsung Museum, shown here on the left. That's the Korean example, which deviates from the typical iconography of Goryeo Buddhist paintings. This work faithfully represents Amitabha's descent. You can see some clouds there under his feet that is described in the scripture. In comparison with the Shisha Chinese example on the right, there's a much more complex composition in the Chinese example. The Shisha depictions of the descent include the soul of the deceased. You can see that little miniature figure here to the bottom left-hand corner. So that is actually the dying soul that the Buddha is descending to redeem. And other compositional elements to make this a much more complex vision that is truer to the sutra descriptions of the actual event, so truer to the narrative than the Korean example. In a broad sense, most of the Korean Buddhist paintings do not widely diverge from the iconographic categories of Chinese Buddhist paintings, but they display a number of differences in the representational techniques, since their creation consistently strove to differentiate their works from the Chinese models. A good example is the painting of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, seen here, and it's being compared with a Chinese example on the right by the artist Mu Qi, 13th century. The Chinese painting, complicating things even further, the Chinese painting is actually in a Japanese Buddhist temple. Despite some differences, such as the lack of a background in the Korean example, again showing that kind of simplification that's going on with the treatment of the subject and the removal of narrative details, that you focus chiefly on the deity himself or herself, this painting presents essentially the same iconography as the renowned white robe Avalokiteshvara at Daitokuji in Japan, painted by Mu Chi, shown on the right. The deities are dressed almost identically and have similar postures and garment folds. Nevertheless, while reflecting the essential Chinese iconographic presentation through traditional Goryeo Buddhist painting techniques, the Korean painting of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara did not stop at merely adopting the iconography, but also succeeded in recreating it through modifications. The transformation extends to include the meaning and function of the Buddhist iconography in a Korean context. Therefore, one needs to consider the following questions. Do the Goryeo Buddhist paintings display a clear understanding of the original meaning of the iconographic prototype in China? Was a complete understanding of the iconography based on the original context acquired in the process of the reception of the Chinese image? And did the process of transmission involve changes in the essential nature of the prototype iconography? And the answer seems to be in every case, yes. Unlike the Goryeo case, in this, it is nearly impossible to define elements in Chinese Buddhist paintings simply or essentially simply because the tradition is so much more complex and was influenced by so many more factors over a longer period of time. There are also regional and functional differences, as well as materials and the training of the different Chinese painters. Although the examples are rather limited and have been chosen, although these examples are relatively limited and have been chosen simply for the sake of comparison, I'll attempt to point out some of the obvious differences between the Chinese examples and the Goryeo example. And I just chose one of those three in the previous slide. When comparing the Goryeo descent of Amitabha at Shoboji, here on the left, to the descent of Amitabha from southern Sung, China, on the right, we can see very significant differences, even though the two paintings are nearly identical in basic coloring, posture, and costume. For a student who's just coming to this subject, these two paintings look very, very similar. And hopefully by the end of this brief comparison, we'll be able to sense what makes them so different from one another and what illustrates the uniqueness and the individuality of the Goryeo religious painting tradition. Compared to the Shoboji work, the Korean work on the left, the Chinese painting exhibits a restrained use of decorative patterns, while the lines on the surface defining garment folds and so on stand out much more strongly in the Chinese example. Moreover, the Chinese example depicts the Buddha's right arm as if it is being seen through a translucent robe. You can see the forearm all the way up into the upper arm through this translucent robe. This examination of the paintings of the descent of Amitabha suggests that Buddhist paintings from China convey a stronger sense of material reality. The deity seems more like a living figure rather than the more decorative sense that is observed in the Korean Goryeo Buddhist example. It should also be noted that while the decorative pattern of the Chinese Buddhist paintings of the Sung and Yuan are as varied as their colors, the lotus roundel pattern, the pattern most frequently found in Goryeo Buddhist paintings, does not appear in these Chinese examples. Now let's turn to a comparison with Japan. Actually, the iconographies of Japanese Buddhist paintings are so distinct that it appears to be almost impossible to compare them with Goryeo ones. For instance, the iconography found in paintings of the descent of Amitabha typically involve showing the figure in a landscape setting, which we haven't seen in Korean examples. Today, I will briefly point out the differences between a Goryeo and a Japanese Buddhist image using these two examples. The style of the Goryeo Buddhist painting of the Buddha Amitabha, shown here on the left, is quite unlike the Buddhist painting from the Heian period that I'm comparing it to, that's now in the Nara National Museum on the right. The Japanese Buddhist paintings use various colors and shading techniques, and we've already noted that you don't see that same kind of shading of color in Goryeo Buddhist paintings. In the Japanese examples, this shading is used to enhance the realism of the deities. So again, we're seeing the same interest in the reality of the subject matter that was really not present in the more decorative treatment in Korea. Thus, the Japanese paintings appear more sculptural than the Goryeo Buddhist paintings. We're getting into the surface of the works here. And you can see the way that the shading is used in the Japanese example on the left compared to the flatter treatment of the elbow and forearm on the right in the Korean example. Furthermore, there's a technical difference. The Japanese artists use cut pieces of gold leaf, and that's what we're seeing here. These are actually minute little cut pieces of gold leaf that are glued to the surface of the Japanese painting. We don't see that in Korea. All of this is gold pigment that is applied by a brush to the surface. The Japanese technique called kirikani, or cut gold, is characteristic both of religious paintings in Japan and also in the decoration of lacquer in Japan, and is not seen in Goryeo Buddhist paintings. To sum up and to ensure that we have enough time for questions, I'd like to conclude here. So we now know, you're experts in Korean Goryeo Buddhist paintings. There are 165 examples worldwide, a relatively small body of works, and they display a very narrow iconographic range and have a strong tendency to emphasize the subject because they were commissioned by a homogeneous group of patrons, and they were used for a very similar purpose. And I'm delighted to say that we'll be looking at 3 examples tomorrow in storage that will allow you to apply some of what we've been learning today and actually looking at these paintings. And they present 3 of the characteristic iconographies that we've looked at here: the Avalokiteshvara, seated on a rock, the Kshtagarbha, standing with the wish-granting jewel, and then an Amitabha seated with the 8 great bodhisattvas. So I hope you'll enjoy that. In the field of Buddhist art history, it is nearly impossible to figure out the differences between artistic products of various cultures, regions, and periods if we focus only on the iconography. Therefore, we have to really look at the style and the painting technique to distinguish Korea, Japan, and China. I believe that the objective factors shown in the artworks themselves, such as the techniques used to render them and their expression, are the most crucial clues that we have to properly address the historical meaning and the uniqueness of each work. Goryeo Buddhist paintings reflect the iconography of Chinese Buddhist paintings, but their creators held on to their individuality and their own traditional painting techniques, and therefore altered the Chinese model to suit a local taste and a local tradition. The unique characteristics of Goryeo Buddhist paintings can be defined very simply as follows: a focus on the figure, elegance and delicacy of representation, homogeneity in function. And I'll stop there and answer questions that you may have. Yeah?
It seems like the majority of these that we know of now are held in Japan. When they were in Japan, the paintings that are held there, were they used devotionally more, or are they seen more as artistic objects?
They were the historical context here is really important, and I'm glad you raised this. Of course, these were all produced in Korea by Korean patrons in Korean painting workshops for use in Korea. You're right, almost all of them now are in Japan. That transmission probably happened chiefly in the late 15th, 16th century with the Hideyoshi invasions of the Korean peninsula, when basically Korea was ransacked and things of value were taken back to Japan, including all of the works, many of the works that we were looking at this morning. A lot of them ended up in Japanese Buddhist temples and were in religious use, along with Chinese examples that had also been brought back from the mainland. But over the course of centuries, the tradition, the identity of the images, their sources, and what it reflected of mainland Asia was lost, essentially. So it wasn't until the 20th century that a lot of these works were first identified or re-identified as Korean products, not Japanese products or Chinese products. It's really interesting to look at the examples that are in U.S. collections that I know quite well. There's 16 in U.S. museums. Almost all of them were acquired as Chinese or Japanese works. And it really wasn't until the studies of the 70s and 80s going onwards that the Korean tradition was first identified and then second studied in greater depth so that we understand the kinds of details that characterize these works. Otherwise, they would have been completely lost, I think, to cultural history, kind of intermixed with the more prevalent Chinese and Japanese examples. Great question. Yeah.
Do you think the decision by the Goryeo painters, or maybe whoever was instructing the Goryeo painters to paint these deities in such a way to distinguish them from the Chinese or the Japanese, do you think that was an intentional, as a way to sort of express their views into Buddhism itself?
Almost like a kind of cultural nationalism. I think there must have been, and then also, each culture had its own traditions that it was drawing upon. So I think the significance of gold in the Korean examples has a much older basis and is much more prevalent in these works than you would find in China. So I think as iconographies were adopted and images were created to illustrate those iconographies, they took on a kind of local character. I mean, you can certainly find Chinese examples, and we looked at some of them this morning that are very similar iconographically, but when you start to penetrate the surface, you see that the actual tradition, the artistic traditions are a little bit different, and that's the local factor. They obviously had great respect for their own traditions and didn't simply adopt the Chinese methods of painting, the Chinese approaches to pigment, and so on, that they were seeing in the Chinese prototypes. They were adopting those and kind of making them more purely Korean. Yeah?
Was there an influence on European art from these paintings? Because there's so many of the images have connections to like the Renaissance and halos.
Right. Actually, the use of halos is something that was borrowed both by Asia and Europe from the ancient Near East. This practice of fire worship that is associated really more with the ancient Near Eastern world or West Asian world is something that traveled in both directions. But you're right, I mean, there's a kind of resonance, and that's why I started with that Trecento image of an Italian altar painting, because there's a kind of resonance there, the abstraction of the figure from any kind of a setting, the focus on the deities, the use of gold as a kind of otherworldly reference, the richness of the pigments, the kind of purely saturated, strong mineral colors. All of these kind of build a resonance that you could say almost links Trecento or Quattrocento Italy with East Asia and the Goryeo examples that we're looking at here. I doubt if there's any kind of direct physical correspondence communication that's going on. Artists weren't traveling quite that far at that point. But there's almost a kind of zeitgeist, a spirit of the moment worldwide that might suggest why you see these very similar phenomena appearing both in Western Europe and in Eastern Asia. But yeah, I feel it myself. Also, the moment in the figural traditions are very, very similar as the figures are beginning to become more plastic, more sculptural in character. They're not simply flat, patterned figures with with human features. They're really beginning to feel more like three-dimensional depictions in a two-dimensional world, both in Italy and in East Asia. Yeah.
Are there some differences in the Buddhism that is visible in the artwork when comparing the Chinese to the Korean?
We're looking at a very narrow subject matter in the Korean examples. Almost all of them relate to what's called Pure Land Buddhism. Pure Land Buddhism was associated with the Buddha Amitabha. We've seen a lot of images of Amitabha this morning, and his bodhisattvas, his assistants, Avalokiteshvara was one of them. We saw a lot of images, all those images of the deity sitting on the rock. Those are all Avalokiteshvara. These are salvation images. Amitabha is the Buddha of the Western paradise. So he is the leader of a kind of paradise cult. And his bodhisattvas or his assistants, his spiritual reflections that are meant to help suffering souls go to his paradise became very, very popular in East Asia, but especially popular in Korea in the Goryeo period. It's almost a kind of millennial feeling, like I want to be reborn in paradise. I don't want to go through the standard Buddhist cyclical cycles of rebirth, each time trying to further perfect my soul, ultimately to reach nirvana. Pure Land Buddhism promises that if you call upon the divine help of Amitabha Buddha or his bodhisattvas Avalokiteshvara Mahastama Prapta, you can immediately travel to the Pure Land, to the Western paradise. So you can imagine, among suffering people, the idea of being able to just call on a deity and then upon death be transferred to his heavenly paradise, it would have been a very compelling kind of belief. That belief was especially strong in Korea. In China, Pure Land Buddhism existed. In Japan, Pure Land Buddhism existed at a kind of popular level in all three. What's interesting is, though, in both China and Japan, you had other sects of Buddhism, other types, other schools of Buddhism that were going on at the same time. All of you, I'm sure, have heard about Zen Buddhism. This was a period when Zen Buddhism in Japan and Chan Buddhism, which is the same notion, the same belief, was flourishing in China. There is not a particularly strong Zen or Chan or Sun reflection in Korean images at this time. So it seems that, we are looking at a particular kind of Buddhism that was uniquely popular in Korea, also popular in China and Japan, but much more popular in Korea than you find in Japan or China. Yeah?
In the Korean style of painting here, are there any shamanistic influences?
Here, not yet. Shamanism is very, very strong in Korea throughout time. We don't have any depictions of shamanic deities at this period that have survived. They may well have been created. Most of the religious shaman paintings that have survived from Korea are much later, but reflect very similar styles, very similar approaches, typically single figures, sometimes in groups, but usually single figures without any sense of a setting, and no landscape, that the figures are individual, isolated, and depicted in a very similar, typically frontal fashion. Yeah?
Would you say these are particularly sensitive to light because of the materials?
Yeah, we should talk a little bit about condition. All of the paintings, as I mentioned, all of the paintings are executed in these rich mineral pigments on a silk support. None of them are painted on paper. Silk is an organic material, as you all know. It is susceptible to color change over time when exposed to light. And so that's why if you walk into an East Asian painting gallery, you'll see these, kind of strong paintings on a light-colored or white background in the same context as these really dark paintings. The light-colored paintings are probably painted on paper, which does also change over time, but changes much more gradually. The dark paintings will almost always be paintings that were done on silk, which changes much more dramatically over time. As the support or as the fabric darkens, it also dulls the intensity of the surface pigments. Also, some of the surface pigments, if they are particular kinds of minerals, those minerals can interact with the silk support and actually eat away at the silk that is the ground of the painting. As the pigments eat away at the silk that is the support of the painting, large areas can even fall off. So yeah, these are organic living things. Paintings change over time, and we have to be really, really careful if we're going to be good caretakers to restrict the exposure of the work. So typically we will only show any of our paintings for a 6-month period out of 5 years maximum. Some museums are now going to 8 or 10-year intervals where the painting is sleeping. So the viewing that you'll have tomorrow is really a rare occasion for us to bring the paintings out. They were last shared with the public in an exhibition about 7 years ago. Yeah.
Also, the technique of painting on the front and the back, was that unique to Korea or the others?
It was not unique to Korea, but it was particularly favored in Korea and during this time period. So that a lot of the paintings, and we'll be looking at one tomorrow that is particularly relevant, the Kshitagarbha painting that I showed at the beginning of the presentation, the deity holding the transparent wish-granting jewel. He is painted with his flesh, face and arms, hands, still kind of in a pink fleshy color, whereas the other two paintings in the collection, the skin color is gold. If you look at the Kshitagarbha, the pink fleshy areas, you can see that the reason why they're pink is their red has been applied from the front and white has been applied from the back, and so the white is showing through the support, through the silk, through the red painting on the red pigment on the surface to give you that kind of rosy pink color. And it was applied in such a way that it makes the face feel a little bit rounder, more sculptural than it does with a flat application of gold that you'll see on the other two paintings. Yeah.
Were the works generally signed by the artists, and were there famous artists?
No, that's another difference between East Asia and the Italian world of the Trecento, Quattrocento. There are no known artists in East Asia. These are, like the Trecento and Quattrocento, a lot of them were produced in workshops, but the workshops did not carry the name of famous artists of the time period, so they are all anonymous. They were probably collaborative works, so there may have been more than one person involved in the production of any one work. And I think by placing them within that kind of a creative context, a workshop, as opposed to an artist's atelier, it also helps us understand the consistency of the compositions. These models that are repeated over and over and over again, they may well have been models. There may have been tracings of particularly successful representations of the compositions, so that if you were going to paint Avalokiteshvara, you had a model of what it was supposed to look like, and you may have even traced that model, so that that helps us understand why these look so similar. Likewise, to the level of the patterns on the robes, many of those patterns are repeated across a number of paintings, so that again there must have been, I don't know if they were swatch books or again just kind of models that the painters could have referred to if they wanted to paint a chrysanthemum roundel, a lotus roundel, what have you. So that kind of thing tends to happen more often in a workshop where things can be archived and references can be made across time to these shared models.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
Would you say that there are instances though where there are individual artists' names and their what are they called?
Stamps.
Stamps or chops.
Yeah.
Like for instance, in Song, China, there's the Chenlong, I don't know if I said the name right, dragons, those 9 dragons. And then in Japan, I think there were some Zen paintings that may have the artist names on them.
In the religious tradition that we're looking at here in Korea, no. There are, we don't have names, even in recorded literature. And the only times that seals have helped us at all is often their ownership or temple seals. So they don't signify the maker, they signify the owner. And typically those seals were applied after they went to Japan, not while they were in use in Korea. So I think that also reinforces this notion that it was a workshop production for a very limited number of patrons, and the paintings were probably kept and transmitted generation upon generation. They were typically used at death. As your relative was dying, you would put up one of these Pure Land paintings, helping the dying soul to have some kind of faith and some kind of hope of being reborn in Amitabha's paradise. So I think the functional context is also kind of important here. They weren't wall paintings, they weren't meant for constant display. They were used very episodically and for very specific purposes.
As a quick side note, if I might just say, not a question, but if you want to see some of the techniques, we have a great artist at the Korean Cultural Center on display now and does the front and back silk paintings.
Oh, great.
And you can see the different stages of production to get a sense of that glow that you were talking about. So it's only up for a couple more days the rest of this week.
Yeah, if you haven't been to the Korean Cultural Center, I give a big shout out. They have been a great partner for us over the years, continue to be. They have their own exhibitions going on, their own exhibition program. And yeah, this is a great opportunity to see firsthand that technique that is perfected in Korea.
Great, well, thank you so much.
Sure.